Sit. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Antoinette Parks. I am a prevention consultant here at NJ4S Exits. So, just to give you a little bit about what we do, Family Connections is the Essex County hub for New Jersey statewide student support services, NJ4S. NJ4S Access is all about strengthening the social, emotional, and mental health for our students, our parents, and our educators. We have over 50 prevention and mental health professionals, and we are all trained in the latest evidence based practices. Um, and so we go out to schools and we host tier one services, which is presentations. We do group services, which is our tier two, and we do tier three services, which is more on a clinical one-on-one basis. We serve all of Essex County public schools, but we prioritize on our middle and high school students. Schools that are, we have 21 high need schools in our district. And so we thank you guys for being here. And before I turn it over to Corey, who's going to talk about understanding the teenage brain, we do encourage that you guys all stay to the end. We do have a raffle that we want to give for Amazon gift card. So just stay on to the end and we will give that gift card out. Okay. Thank you and have a good help. Webinar, sorry. Corey, it's your turn.
Thanks so much, Antoinette. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the latest installment of our parent caregiver webinars for NJ4S Essex. And tonight we're going to be talking about the teenage brain. And so hopefully you'll find something in here, a little bit new information for you. If you haven't joined one of our webinars before, we're from Partnership to End Addiction, which is a nonprofit. And we are a partner with NJ4S at Six. So we are, our whole goal is to improve the outcomes of for young people so that they can live healthy, addiction-free lives. And a big part of that is understanding healthy youth development and the teenage brain. And so if you haven't met us before, my name's Cori. I'm the Director of Prevention Services at Partnership. I'm joined tonight by Dr. Linda Richter, who's the Senior VP of Prevention Research at Partnership. And also on the call, I think, is Janelle, who's our Associate Director. Um, but here is what we're going to go over tonight. And if it's possible, if you're able to mute yourself just so we don't have background noise, that would be fabulous. Um, and so what we're going to go over is adolescent brain development. And then we're going to talk about how brain development relates to substance use. Again, we're from Partnership to End Addiction, so we bring everything back to addiction science and substance use. We're going to talk about what parents and caregivers can do once you've learned so much about the brain. Okay, now what do you do with it? Finally, we'll share some resources from Partnership to End Addiction. We'll have some time to go over any questions that you might have at the end, and then we will pass it back to the NJ4S team to do the raffle. And so first, just to get our mind working, just kind of think to yourself, when you're thinking of teenagers, what words come to mind? What adjectives, what words do you think of when you think of teenagers? Some of them might be nice words, some of them might be not so nice words. Um, Maybe you're thinking things like rebellious or moody, or maybe you're thinking of something else. But just think to yourself, I see in the chat sassy. Perfect. Yeah, that's a great word. Um, Let me get the chat to go away. And so keep that in your mind as we're going through this. Know it all. Yep. Great words. Um, and so to start us out here, why is learning about the teenage brain important? So we know that parents are often baffled by their kids' behavior. They see their teens taking unnecessary risks or making really rash decisions, and they don't understand why their kids aren't seeing the potential consequences. On the other hand, teens might feel like their parents or caregivers don't understand them, or household rules are really getting in the way of what they want to do. And so it might feel like kind of this butting heads, like these deer in the picture here. It might feel like the teen versus the adult, and that only one's going to win. And so you might wonder, is there a better way for all of this to happen? And so learning about the teen brain, why they do what they do, can help caregivers improve the relationship that they have with their teen. It can help to turn the temperature down in some of those tense family moments and can help parents to implement effective strategies to help keep their kids safe and healthy. Because at the end of the day, that's what matters. We want to show parents that teens, aren't some aliens sent to Earth to make your life difficult. There's biological reasons why they act the way they do. And so, if parents and caregivers have a greater understanding of what's going on with their teen at this point in life, they might feel better empowered to know how to react when their teen is acting out or behaving strangely or struggling. And so let's talk about adolescent brain development. I know that this talk is titled Understanding the Teenage Brain, but we're really talking about adolescence, the whole period. And so adolescence consists of these different phases. There's early, middle, and late adolescence, and then transitions into early adulthood. So early adolescence is about age 10 to 12-ish. Middle adolescence would be 13 to 15, late adolescence about 16 to 18, and then after that, adulthood. These phases are different for every young person. And we know that young people, adolescents, are an incredibly diverse population. They make up almost 23% of the US population, so there's a lot of them. We know that the adolescent brain, so the time between puberty and mid-20s, there's huge advances in learning and creativity. There's plasticity, which is the ability of the brain and the nervous system to change in response to what's going on around it. So it's the ability of our brain to adapt and learn a lot of new things. You may have heard that it's a lot easier to learn a new language when you're younger. That's because our brains are plastic and can make all of these new connections for new skills like language. The adolescent brain's also very resilient. It's resilient to childhood trauma and distress. Kids are very resilient little creatures and can get through a lot. But the adolescent brain is responsible for a lot of those words that maybe you thought to yourself in the beginning. It is, if maybe you said negative leaning words, things like impulsive or emotional or moody, there's a reason for all of that, and we will get into those reasons. And so a lot of people like to say that the adolescent brain, the teen brain, is immature. And so we like to say that the adolescent brain is not immature, but it is uniquely adapted for their particular life stage. The teenage brain isn't just a less developed adult brain. It's very much purposefully designed to meet the challenges and the opportunities of being a teenager. Teens aren't just kind of passively moving through life, they very much actively shape their development. They're constantly learning from the things around them and what's going on around them. Um, we also know that teens are a little bit more prone to taking risks than adults are. And we also know that not all risk is bad. Some teens might take risks to be impulsive. Um, this behavior is often tied to kind of heightened sensitivity to rewards. They want new experiences, they want to see and experience new things, so they may take some risks. But it's not just about thrill seeking and doing dangerous things, for instance. It's often about exploring and learning and growing. And so taking risks can lead to a lot of creativity and discovery. And when guided appropriately, these tendencies can really help teens find new interests and build resilience and develop into really confident, capable adults. But it also comes with some vulnerability. And so the excitement and the emotions of this time are both a really great opportunity, but they're also kind of risky. So a little bit more of the science behind this, and I'll try not to take too long and bore you with this. But an important place to start is the fact that different parts of the brain are developing faster than others. And so you can see on the graph on the left here that at age 12, this is a functional MRI that's showing different parts of the brain. And so fully developed parts of the brain are going to be like a purple color, and not fully developed parts of the brain are going to be yellow and green. And so blue's somewhere in the middle. And so you can see between the ages of 12 and 20, the brain is going through a lot of maturing and developing. Even at age 20, it's not fully purple. There's still some development going on. Um, and then the brain labeled here on the right, these are three different parts of the brain that are important because they're involved in addiction. And so we'll talk a lot about them later. But the basic idea here is that um, this front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the blue part on the right there, is one of the slowest to develop. That one's not fully developed until 25 or later. And that's what's involved with critical thinking, weighing out risks. Some of our personality is in there. It's involved in a lot of our kind of deep adult executive thinking. While the other parts of the brain, the ones in the back, the basal ganglia and the extended amygdala, those are what's called the limbic system. And so that is our emotional center. That's very much involved in survival. And so that signals to the brain things like being hungry, being thirsty, needing, sustenance to keep ourselves alive. So that's what that part of the brain is really involved in. And that part of the brain develops a lot faster. And so that part in a teenager is almost fully developed. And so this leads to some vulnerability in teens where their emotional center of the brain is fully developed and ready to go, but the part of the brain that knows how to weigh the pros and cons of a decision and can really think forward ahead to consequences is not as fully developed. And so the common metaphor is often that a teenage brain is all gas, no brakes. You may have heard that before, alluding to the fact that teens have a tendency to be risk takers and kind of out of control and no thoughts for consequences. And this isn't a totally fair way of looking at the teenage brain. It's not like once someone turns 22, they no longer take any risks ever again. And it's not like all teenagers are really risk-taking. Um, but it is a time when kids will most likely encounter risky situations for the very first time, and they may not prioritize the consequences over the potential reward. Um, and so it does require having caring adults in the environment to try to keep kids safe because they don't always have kind of the forward thinking that's needed to make smart decisions. So, a little bit more about this. The areas of the brain that are fully developed in adolescence would be things like the cerebellum that controls our physical activity, the part that controls our emotions and our fear, the part that goes between motivation and action. So, a lot of our survival techniques are fully formed. Um, and again, that limbic system, which is involved in reward seeking. And again, the area that's like not fully matured yet is that prefrontal cortex that is involved in judgment and long-term planning and controlling our impulses. And so the sudden force of teenagers often takes parents by surprise. And part of that can be because the ages of 6 to 11 for a lot of kids is what developmental psychologists call latency. So this is a time period where kids kind of simmer down and often are pretty easygoing until they become teenagers, kind of 12, 13, and then everything ramps up. And so we know that the brain is developing in a different way in this kind of latency period. Um, it's pruning and renovating for adulthood hasn't totally started yet. And so there's this kind of easygoing period that maybe lures parents into a false sense of security. And then the teenager comes out and the parents are like, oh gosh, now what do we do? But it's important to think about what's going on in the brain in this kind of crazy seeming time. And so the brain is undergoing massive changes from the ages of 11 to 12 until the kind of mid to late 20s. And so what it's doing is it is pruning, so kind of cutting away nerve cells and connections that it doesn't use very often, and it's building really strong, fast connections between the nerves that and the neurons that it uses all the time. And so it's increasing the processing speed along connections that we need the most. And so it's this idea of use it or lose it, the sense that the brain cell connections that are not used get pruned to make way and make room for those that we do use. And so, what are the skills and the connections and things that we want teenagers to use? Things like executive functioning. So, we want teenagers to be able to regulate their emotions, and we want them to have time management skills, and we want them to be able to focus and have their attention on something. We want them to be organized and control their impulses and solve problems. And all of these things are not something that a 6 or 7-year-old can do so well, but they are things that we start to learn and practice as teenagers. And so, as the brain is going through all of these changes, we want to really practice the skills that we want them to have as an adult because the brain is making room for the skills and the things that it's going to use as an adult. And so it's the same idea as like muscle memory. You know, if you do a repetitive motion enough times, your muscles will remember it and strengthen and stretch in a way to make that movement easier, to where you don't really have to think about it anymore. And so that's the brain kind of making that fast processing for things we do all the time. Think about when you first learned how to type on a keyboard, how hard it was to like remember where the letters are and remember what finger goes where. But you practiced it enough to where now you don't have to think about it as much. It's in your brain, and you don't have to take the time to think about it at all. So, in adolescence, when all of this pruning and connection building is happening, we want to make sure that we're strengthening the skills we want. Adults will often tell teens that it's their hormones that are causing um, their moodiness and all of their difficulties. This doesn't go over super well. Hormones definitely cause a lot of changes in the teenage years. They're really responsible for a lot of the physical changes that happen during puberty. There's not a lot of research that shows puberty hormones and moodiness or emotionality are so related. Um, so, but we do know that teens are trying to harness some powerful, unpredictable emotions. Their brains are really sensitive during this time. They're producing a lot of emotions. The emotions are just stronger in this period of life. The highs are high and the lows are low, which isn't always a bad thing. You know, if you think about how fondly you remember the music that you loved when you were a teenager, a lot of that has to do because of your increased emotionality at this point in your life. It really leaves an imprint on you because everything feels so important. And so we want to know that that's how our teens are feeling so that we can react accordingly. And so we can really harness the power of those emotions so that really intense emotions can be overwhelming, but we can also direct it towards positive actions and really supportive outlets. So the really high emotionality of teenagers can be really useful if we put it towards things like mentorship programs and leadership roles and creative endeavors like writing and storytelling, artistic endeavors like music and drawing and dancing, or activism and community engagement. You know, for many years, adolescence was viewed as like a deficit that teens are just impulsive and immature and take risks. Um, we really want to see it instead, not as a problem that we have to fix, but as a really powerful and important stage of life that we can nurture and guide in order to create really confident, and happy adults. And so, quickly, what are some of the factors that affect brain development? We know that everyone's brain develops in a slightly different way, and that's one part that makes humans amazing. But we know that there are some things that can get in the way of healthy youth development. And one of those things are a group of things called adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. And so these are potentially traumatic events that occur during childhood that can have long-lasting consequences into adulthood. And so they include things like physical and emotional or sexual abuse. They also include things like growing up in a household where there's mental illness or substance use, domestic violence, or a family member who is incarcerated. And it's important to know that the more of these a child experiences, the greater their risk for developing serious health and emotional challenges later in life. These can really affect brain development and behavior and even someone's physical health. Unfortunately, these experiences are really common. In the US, about 35 million children have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. Even more concerning, we know that about 12.5% of young people have experienced four or more of these experiences, which we know really increases someone's risk for depression, anxiety, substance use, and a whole host of negative health conditions. And what ACEs do in the body is that they trigger what's called toxic stress. And so that is, if you've heard of the fight or flight response, if you're in a survival situation, you might fight or flight or freeze if you've heard of the third. Um, but basically, it's this internal alarm system that we have in our body where our heart rate increases, our blood pressure increases, and we can get some damage to some of the body systems that we have. The stress response is really good if you're trying to outrun a bear or if you're trying to protect yourself in a really unsafe situation. It's not good if you're living in this fight or flight response all the time. And so, what ACEs and some of these traumatic experiences do is that they lead the body to kind of be in that fight or flight response all the time, which is really detrimental to the body. And that's what gets in the way of healthy brain development. And so, too much of that chronic stress can really stop healthy brain development and increase the risk for a lot of health problems down the line. And we all know that these effects are often intergenerational, so that if they happen to the parents, it then leads to an increased risk for the kids, and then kind of so on and so forth. And so when we recognize these signs and we recognize these events for what they are, we can get people the help that they need. A little bit more about chronic stress. We know that chronic stress in children can harm important parts of the brain that we need. And that can lead to problems like trouble solving problems, increased impulsivity, difficulties managing emotions. It can also lead to challenges with learning and memory. It can cause kids to feel more anxiety. They may have difficulty making safe choices, and they may be more likely to take risks. And although we're talking about brain development and hormones and all of these things that are going on internally, kids just aren't at the mercy of biology. The environment plays a huge role in what is going on. So this graph, I know it's kind of a lot to look at, but we can imagine it like the board game of life. So we have that light blue line, and then we have that royal blue line, and those are two different people on the game of life. And so a person's life path can change for better or worse based on what is going on around them at each stage. So we can see the royal blue person. They started out with economic hardships, so they were kind of lower, but then they had a positive school environment, and then they had access to good health care. But then they had job insecurity as they became an adult. And then the light blue line, they started out, they had positive parenting, but then they got involved with the justice system, and then they have positive support from their parents. So a person's life path can change for better or worse at any life stage. And so protective environments, so things that are protective for us, like a supportive relationship with our family, um, access to resources and care, can lead to healthy development, while harmful experiences, such as toxic stress or housing insecurity, may lead to more at risk and make life more difficult. And so our genes and our brain development are also impacted by what's going on around us. Some other kind of protective factors, so good things in the environment that are good for our brain development, include things like having a trusted adult role model, living in a safe neighborhood, having strong attachments to family and school, and having a lot of really positive extracurriculars. So now I'm going to pass it to Linda to go through how brain development relates to substance use.
Thank you, Cori. So we're going to start off with these two scary graphs that are just meant to kind of reiterate some of what Cori said before, but thinking about having them top of mind as we talk about substance use in young people. And when I talk about substance use, what I am referring to is the use of tobacco or nicotine products, alcohol products, marijuana or cannabis, the misuse of prescription drugs or any illegal drug use. So that's what we call generally substance use. So if you look at that graph on the left, it looks a little scary, but it's really meant to just remind you of what Cori mentioned earlier, which is that those limbic regions of the brain, which are those that are responsible for emotions, develop sooner in a young person than the parts of the brain in the prefrontal cortex that are responsible for good decision making and judgment and impulse control and all the things we want to see in our teenagers, but we have to wait to see them in full. So again, some kids have them earlier, some kids have them later, but this is a graph showing that there is this gap for a few years in adolescence between when the emotions are running high and the reasoning is kind of running a little bit low. And it's not because our kids are bad kids or because they're trying to drive us crazy. It's purely biological. That part of the brain that allows them to act like the adults we want them to act like are not yet fully developed. And so it's just important to kind of mind that gap when we're interacting with them and be aware of this difference in how the teenage brain works when we're watching their behaviors and responding to them. Another useful graph to have in mind is the one on the right. This is referring to something called sensation seeking, which is what it sounds like, which is that young people like to seek out sensation. In other words, they have a heightened attraction to new and exciting experiences, despite them being risky. And they have that more than adults do, for the most part. And what you see here in this graph that's important to recognize is that this tendency towards sensation seeking peaks at around age 19 for males and around age 16 for females. So girls show that sensation seeking a little earlier in adolescence than boys do. But nonetheless, adolescence is when you're going to see a peak of this kind of risk taking and sensation seeking. And it is normal and it is just part of normal human development. So just kind of keep those two things in mind as we talk about why young people are at higher risk of substance use and why substance use during this time period is particularly risky. So being prone to sensation seeking means that adolescents are more likely to take all kinds of risks, some good, some bad, but one of them is experimenting with substances. The bottom line here is that that's normal, but the problem is that the developing brain is also more easily damaged by these substances. So when a young person uses alcohol or nicotine or marijuana or other drugs, it affects their brains much more than it does when an adult uses those substances. And it can cause more lasting damage in a young person than it does in an adult. So teens are at higher risk of developing what's known as a substance use disorder, or we call it addiction, if they use a substance than adults are. So what we want to take a look at is how do psychoactive substances affect the teenage brain? And when we say psychoactive, we mean that it's something that we take in, again, nicotine, alcohol, marijuana, other drugs, that causes changes in our brain and affects how we feel and how we experience the world around us. So most of the addictive substances that we can think of are psychoactive, and they produce their effects in the brain in three different ways. Some of them affect the brain by mimicking or copying naturally existing processes that occur in our brain. Some do so by slowing down or speeding up the messaging process. So if you think about a substance like alcohol or opioids, those are considered depressants because they slow down the communication or the processing in the brain. Things like caffeine or nicotine or cocaine are considered stimulants because they act the way natural stimulants in our brain do by making things go faster and more quickly. So the substances that we take in or that young people might take in are really doing have processes that very much are similar to things that naturally occur in our brains, but they do so at a greater intensity. So you may have heard of a chemical or what's known as a neurotransmitter called dopamine, and it is a chemical messenger in the brain. And what it does is it's super important for a whole range of life-sustaining behaviors because essentially what it does is it gets released in the brain and it binds to cells in our brain at certain moments that are meant to help us form habits that sustain life, that are really important. So when you eat something good that you like, dopamine is released in the brain. You get sort of a rewarding and pleasurable experience or sensation, and that tells you or your brain, hey, I like that. Let's do that again. Same for drinking, same for sex, same for some people when they, exercise in certain ways or engage in sports or see someone that they love, dopamine gets released and it makes you feel good. It makes you feel like you want to do that behavior again. Unfortunately, alcohol and drugs and nicotine and other substances also release dopamine in the brain, and they copy that process only a little bit more intensely in some cases and much more intensely in others. So it makes you want to do that behavior again. So if you take alcohol and if you use alcohol and you have a big, strong dopamine release in the brain, it's going to form that habit where you're going to want to ingest alcohol again at higher, and it sort of gives it to you in a higher intensity than these naturally occurring behaviors like eating and drinking and sex. So the way to think about substance use and how it affects the brain is to kind of think of a seesaw or a balance. You may remember in high school or middle school, you learned about the process of homeostasis, which is how your body likes to seek balance. So for example, when you get very, very hot, you might sweat because the water that comes out on your skin actually evaporates and cools you off. So when your body feels its temperature is too high, it does certain things to make you cool down because our body and our brain are always seeking balance to be kind of steady. So when too much dopamine surges through our brain, because we have used some kind of substance, the brain will respond to get back to its steady balance by reducing how sensitive it is to that substance. So over time, the brain will become desensitized or not react as much to the substance when you take it in. So if you drink alcohol the first time, your brain's going to have a really powerful response, potentially very pleasurable. But then when you do it again and again, your brain is saying, that's a little bit too much dopamine. It's not where it should be. I'm going to become a little less sensitive to that input of dopamine. I'm going to respond to it less. So what's the experience of the person? The experience of the person is, used to be when I drank one beer, I'd feel great. Now I'm not really feeling much of anything. I better have a second beer. I better have a third beer. I'm trying to get that feeling again. But the brain is saying, that's too much dopamine for me. I'm not going to respond to that. And it keeps becoming more and more desensitized until the point with continued use, a person is going to need a lot of the substance in order to kind of get that positive feeling at all. And over a really long time, which is what we call addiction, really once they use that substance, it's just to kind of get back to that normal, stable state. And they're not even going to feel all that great in the end. The positive effects don't come as easily. So over time, using a substance again and again, a person has to use a lot of that substance just to feel normal or balanced. And the positive effects are much harder to reach. You may have heard of the concept of like chasing a high that you may have had the first time you used a substance. So developing brains are more vulnerable than adults to these kind of changes. And it makes it much harder for a young person to stop using a substance And addiction sets in more quickly and more intensely for teens than it does for adults. And that's again because the brain is under development at this stage. It's not fully formed. Um, so it takes less time from when a young person, for example, smokes a cigarette until they become addicted to nicotine than it does for an adult. It takes less time for a young person from when they first use marijuana to develop a marijuana use disorder than it does for an adult. They're just more vulnerable because of their brain structures at this period of life. We also know from brain imaging studies, and those are studies that kind of take pictures of the brain to see how it works and how it changes over time. We know from these studies that um, the changes happen in parts of the brain that are responsible for key functions, like how a young person regulates their emotions, forms memories, experiences fear and danger. So research shows that teens are less sensitive to some of the undesirable parts of substance use when compared to adults. Um, and that's really concerning because they may, for example, drink a lot of alcohol and not experience a hangover or not experience the same negative effects that adult might experience. So they're not getting those cues or those signs from their experience that might tell an adult, you know what, calm down, stop, don't have that much. You have to go to work in the morning. You don't want to have that headache. For a teenager, they're not as prone to those negative effects in the short term. So they don't have that cue or that signal that says, stop, slow down, you're using too much and you're going to regret it later. So combined with their impulsivity and their sensation seeking and their higher risk of the effects of the substances and less of a response that's negative to it in the short term, all those things make young people more vulnerable and at risk when they use substances compared to adults. We also know, I'll just go back for one more second. I just want to cover that last thing, please. That currently we have substances like marijuana and nicotine that come in higher potency than they did in the past. And we'll talk about that separately in other presentations. But these higher potency substances really affect young people more intensely than they do adults. And we know that they can lead to significant mental health symptoms in young people, again, because this brain is so under development and not fully formed yet and is therefore more vulnerable to the effects of the substances. So we want to talk about, we get a question a lot like, well, if somebody uses substances, you know, can they recover from it fully? Or like if they stop using, is everything going to go back to normal? Um, and the answer is mostly that somebody can recover, obviously, from substance use. But once someone is dependent on or addicted to a substance, it could take the brain a very, very long time to recover. And that's because the damages could be pretty significant. So this, if you look at the right, the picture on the right, this is a classic example. The top row with the yellow brains shows a normal brain or one that is not, you know, using substances. And the second and the third rows are those of somebody who has used cocaine. So yellow is the brain functioning, or how strongly electrical signals go through the brain. And what you're seeing here, so the healthy brain is on top. The second row is someone who has not used cocaine for 10 days, so abstinent for 10 days, okay? So we still see a lot of damage. There's very little yellow there. So after 10 days, not quite recovered. But look at that third row. That's after 100 days of not using the substance. Certainly there's more yellow coming back, so the functioning is returning and the brain is recovering. But even after 100 days, we see that it is still not back to how it was before they started using any cocaine at all. So what this is meant to do is to show, not to scare everybody, but that the damage from substance use can be pretty long lasting and pretty severe. It's true that the adolescent brain may recover more quickly than the adult brain, again, because it's under development and it's malleable and it's plastic, as Cori was saying earlier. But it could still take a pretty long time to return to normal functioning. And again, this varies depending on the particular substance. And we also know that some areas of the brain may never fully recover from substance use, again, depending on which substance we're talking about. Another thing that's important to really understand and to convey to kids is that all brains are different, which is what makes us unique. We have in us, in our brains, different structures and functions. Some people have thicker parts of certain regions of the brain than others, more coding on it. more neurons that are connected or less. And these differences can really dictate how easy it is for an individual person to control their emotions or to self-regulate or to be aware of their body signals or to all the things that make us who we are. But they also could be quite different in terms of how susceptible we are to addiction or substance use disorder. So it could put an individual at naturally higher risk to use substances than another person or to become addicted to it. And the reason I say that that's an important thing to discuss with kids is because a lot of times kids will say, oh, my friend Joe uses marijuana every day and he gets straight A's and he's a great athlete and he's doing amazing and there's no issue with it and he doesn't have any kind of addiction. So why can't I? And the answer is we can't see inside our brains. We don't really know how vulnerable any individual is to developing a substance use disorder. And your friend Joe might be very lucky and less susceptible than your friend Alex or than yourself, who may be more susceptible. So we have to be pretty careful and not make assumptions in that way. But the good news is that the risks that we have that are structural and functional in our brain are not our destiny. The brain systems that we have, as Cori was saying earlier, can be strengthened, especially during the teenage years, to protect against substance use disorder. And teens can really build on skills that buffer against the risks that they may have inherently in their biology. So it's not often discussed as something that increases risk, but how old someone is when they first try alcohol or nicotine or other drugs actually makes a huge difference in their overall risk for developing addiction. If you walk away with anything today, please walk away with this, that the younger someone is when they first try one of these substances, the higher their chance is of developing a substance use disorder or addiction. It's true for literally every type of substance, marijuana, alcohol, nicotine, and we have research data that supports this. We have data that show that individuals who first use a substance before they turn 18 have about a 1 in 4 chance of going on to develop an addiction. For those who just wait a couple of years till they're 21 or older, those odds drop to about 1 in 25, just a few years difference. So delaying the first use of a substance for as long as possible can make a huge difference when it comes to someone's overall risk for substance use disorder. And this is all because of brain development that we've been talking about. Substances like marijuana or alcohol or nicotine are especially harmful to the brain when the development is still going on. And it's more harmful than it would be to a brain that's more fully mature, as one is when they hit their middle to late 20s. So substance use during adolescence can cause permanent changes to the brain, including addiction, and that can last into adulthood. So what can parents and caregivers do with all this information? We can't get into our kids' brains. Kind of sounds like there's a lot going on there, but there are actually a lot of things that we could do. So as Cori kept mentioning, because the brain is under development and it prunes away or gets rid of connections that are not used a lot and keeps those that are used a lot, much like our muscle skills. What we want to do is build the skills that we want to see in young people and reinforce them so that they're there and that they're strong. And we do that by helping young people learn how to have good coping strategies so that they don't turn to substances when they're experiencing stress or problems. And we do that by demonstrating for them on our own and modeling for them healthy coping strategies, how to ask for help, how to have confidence to do the same with their own peers and their own family members, how to recognize and name and acknowledge someone's emotions so that it's less confusing for young people when they feel like they're kind of going all in many directions and off the rails. We could sort of like help them make sense of it. We want to praise resilience. Resilience is a really critical ingredient that helps protect young people from substance use. And it basically means when you could bounce back after a challenge or an adversity. So it doesn't mean we need to avoid or have our children avoid all kinds of challenges or failures or negative things in life. That's impossible. What we really want to reinforce in them is how to bounce back and how to handle those things and not be defeated by them. And again, we could do that by modeling that ourselves and supporting them and praising them when we see them doing that. We also want to help young people from a pretty early age develop the skills that they need to make them feel like they matter, that they're important, that people depend on them, that people need them. They're an important member of the family, of the school community, of the larger community. These are all things that we can help build in young children, these skills that will help protect them against substance use later on. And again, we want to model the behaviors that we want to see in children because kids notice and copy what they see around them and the adults around them. So we don't just want to model the positive behaviors, but we also want to model how to handle things when, they're stressful or not going our way and do it in a positive way. Um, so a critical component of that kind of coping that we're talking about is self-control. We really want to help teens strengthen their ability to kind of think ahead and manage their emotions and resist peer pressure and resist going for things that sort of seem like fun, but are really quite risky and unsafe for them. And again, doing that with the knowledge that it's not that easy for them at this stage of life to kind of rein in those emotions, rein in that sensation seeking, and have that impulse control. It does not come that easily to them because, again, those parts of their brain are not yet completely developed. They're still under construction. So, but the more we encourage goal setting and problem solving and talking through decisions and taking it easy and taking a breath before jumping to a conclusion, and doing that in our conversations with them, but also in the opportunities we provide for them. So activities that help them build their focus. It could be learning a musical instrument or a new language, or having more awareness of their emotions, kind of getting them used to kind of naming how they're feeling and talking about it and making decisions, helping them make good decisions and going through the process with them. Those are ways we could build self-control in kids, even when their brain is not fully equipped to do it completely on their own. And we also want to support kids who are already using substances by helping them understand that there are other ways that they can manage their stress. There are healthier ways to manage their cravings in their bodies to help them make healthier choices. And there are things like mindfulness and breathing exercises and all sorts of programs that are short of actually going to therapy that you could do with a child in the home to kind of help them develop and bolster these coping skills and these stress management skills so that they don't feel like they have to turn to substances when things are not going their way. We really encourage parents to understand, and we hope you're getting this at this point, that when kids do things that we don't want to see, it's usually for a pretty good reason. Young people's undesirable or unhealthy behaviors happen for a rational, developmentally appropriate reason. So what you're seeing in that center picture there are the behaviors at the top of the iceberg, and then underneath the water are all those feelings and needs and motivations and emotions that are causing them to behave in the ways that they are. And the more we can understand the motivation that's underlying these behaviors, the more we can help kids satisfy those needs and those feelings with healthier and safer alternatives. So when we're looking at our kid and saying, why are you behaving this way? You're being ridiculous. The answer is there is a reason why they're behaving that way. And we want to get to that so that we can help them express those feelings and emotions in a healthier way. And there's a way to do that. There's this concept called brain-based praise. It comes from Dr. Crystal Collier, who's a therapist who does a lot of research and work around brain development and parenting. But essentially, it's when your kid does something good, instead of just saying, oh, that was a great job, you could really praise the specific effort that the child put in to that action instead of the ability. So, oh, wow, you took out that recycling without me asking. Thank you for taking that initiative. Or you solved that math problem in such an interesting way. That was awesome. Can you tell me about how you did it? Because what we're trying to do is have our children understand their thought process, understand their feelings, understand their emotions, and be able to talk about it and think it through. And that all reduces that kind of impulsivity and sensation seeking and risk taking and poor coping skills. So we can kind of help them do more of that. Another thing that we want to do is let kids figure it out on their own. So just like when you're kind of building muscles or building strength, it's that use it or lose it principle that if you don't use your muscles for a while, they're going to deteriorate. If we do everything for our kids, they're not going to develop those skills that they need to do them on their own. So what we want to do is help our kids engage in the skills and behaviors that we want to see so that they get repeated and practice and become sort of hardwired in the brain. And that requires watching our kids fail sometimes and not getting too upset about it. because the way we learn the most is when we have sort of a little failure or an imperfection, and we bounce back from it. That's normal, that's important, and that's the learning process. And the eventual goal with our kids is independence and self-sufficiency, not being dependent on adults for every single thing. So the more we could support them in managing their own problems and trying to come up with solutions and coping strategies, the more they'll be able to do so when we're not around once they hit slightly older age, or if we're not in the vicinity when they're facing a problem. And we could do that through different strategies. We could promote healthy, you can go to the next one, promote healthy risk-taking opportunities. So believe it or not, sports allows kids to fail, recover, and, succeed the next time. So teamwork is important in that sense. We can have kids push themselves in academic settings that are challenging for them, or clubs and after-school activities where they have to kind of work with other kids and explore their interests, and maybe not be perfect each time, maybe not get the lead role in the play, but they're still trying and they're learning and they'll try harder the next time. So all these things let teens test themselves, figure out what their skills are, where their talents lie, where they don't maybe, and helps them develop those social and coping and life management skills that are so important for maintaining good relationships and sustaining those relationships, and just kind of feeling good about themselves, and like they don't have to turn to substances to engage with life. One thing we really like to point out, though, because this kind of comes up a lot when people talk about the brain, is we want to frame their brain development in a positive way instead of saying, you don't want to use substances because your brain isn't yet fully formed. It's not developed yet. It's kind of not that effective because it's a little condescending to young people. We don't want to label them as immature or deficient, or like they have no willpower, or they have no ability to control themselves. It's not true, and it's kind of very condescending. So we want to frame adolescence and brain development as much of a positive way as possible. So something like your brain and your body are changing and growing a lot right now. So if you introduce substances at this time of development, it's really harmful for your health and your safety and your future. I care about you. You care about your own well-being. I want to work with you to keep you healthy and safe. And what you'll hear from me and Cori a lot is this notion of keeping kids healthy and safe. That is the priority. And I won't read this whole next slide, but essentially it's an important message that basically frames adolescence as this wonderful time of growth and exploration and opportunity and development, instead of sort of, as Cori was saying earlier, like this negative, these teenagers are like aliens. It's a time for kids to discover and become a force for good in communities and societies, and we want to sort of channel all those interesting parts of adolescence to doing good things as they transition into adulthood. So hopefully after that whole speech, when you now see this question, what do you think, when you think of teenagers, what words come to mind? I'm hoping there's some more positive to it and not just the negative sides. And feel free to put some of those words into the chat now if you've changed your mind at all, or expanded how you think about adolescent development. In our last minute or two, I'm just going to pass it back to Cori to share with you some resources on this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. And I'll go
Yeah.
through these pretty quickly. So on our website, which is drugfree.org, we have a lot of resources that can be really helpful for parents. And this is just a snippet of some of them. So we have playbooks for parents of teens if you're looking for kind of ways to start conversations, or how to react if you're having some argumentative moments with your teen. This resource can be helpful. We also have parenting skills development courses. And so this is it has 12 modules. The whole thing takes about 4 hours, but you can kind of just pick and choose on the website what parts of it are interesting to you that you want to do. It's totally free. Each module takes about 20 to 25 minutes and can really help you with some strategies that you can use in your interactions with a teenage child. We also have a family resource center on drugfree.org. And so basically anything you would ever want to know about preventing substance use, working through substance use, getting treatment, and helping to help someone on a recovery journey all around the family unit is in that family resource center. It's kind of a one-stop shop for a lot of information that you might be looking for. If you want some one-on-one support, drugfree.org, we have a helpline. So you can get immediately connected to a helpline specialist that can help you through whatever it is you're going through. They can help you come up with a treatment plan. They can help you find some resources or just there to hear you out. So we also have online support groups for families that are struggling and personalized text messaging programs for individuals who are hoping to get some kind of one-on-one strategies over text message. And so here's our email addresses, Linda and myself. Please, if you have questions after this, feel free to shoot us an email. We're always happy to respond. But I know it's 6:30 right now, so I want to be cognizant of time.
Well,
If you
Cori,
have,
I do want to just add that someone put a great word for teenagers in the chat.
oh yeah,
Amazing and wonderful aliens.
there we go.
It's perfect. Thank you.
Um, yeah, and so now I'll pass it back to the NJ4S team because I know we want to give out a gift card.
Thank you. Thank you, Cori, and thank you, Linda, as always, for an amazing webinar. Thank you, participants, for joining. I hope you guys was able to learn more about the teenage brain. And so, for sake of time, I'm going to turn it over to Nick, and he will ask the question and give the instructions on the gift cards to get the gift card. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette, for closing out to me. So to make sure you guys were paying attention and that you were actually gaining information from this training, I have one question that I would like for you guys to utilize the chat box for. And the first person to respond to this question will then receive a gift card from Amazon. But I would just ask that once I let you know who the winner is, I will have everyone else leave the Zoom, and then that person who wins will stay on. Okay? So the question is, provide an example of brain-based praise. So in the chat box, provide an example of brain-based praise.
Good, yes. We need an example. I think we have an example. Nick, you're
Yeah, I
muted.
was looking
Okay.
for something a little bit more deeper. Cori or
Okay.
Linda? Which one do you guys think?
I
I was thinking
think,
something more deeper.
yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it seems like Stacy was
I
first.
think Stacy
First,
was
got you.
first. Yes.
Let's see. You took out the recycling. Great job. Perfect. So for me, the reason why I asked this question, I think we're doing this work. I do notice a lot of times a lot of kids don't get those praises when they're doing things that are great. I feel like most of the time, it's always a lot of negative responses back when they're not doing what they're supposed to do. So it's always good to see us kind of step away from always giving the negative and give a positive, which is part of the brain-based praise. So good job, Stacey Haynes. You stay on. Everyone else, thank you all for again joining us this evening. We host these webinars every month. And continue
Thank
to
you.
follow us on all our social media platforms. We have YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. Just type in NJ4SX6 and you can get all things NJ4SX6 on those social media platforms. Again, have a great night and stay warm. I know it's kind of cold out, so stay warm.
Thank
And
you.
Stacy, you just stay on.
May I ask a quick question? You said, will this be uploaded?